Wilson sending a message to Caitlin Clark. I'm going to see you at All-Star Weekend. And when I see you, we gon' talk. And it ain't gonna be just me. It's gonna be me. It's gonna be Chelsea Gray. It's gonna be all the activists in the WNBA. We're gonna come knocking on your front door at the hotel room and say, listen up.
Imagine spending nearly 3 decades begging the world to pay attention to your sport. Imagine watching empty arenas, midnight television slots, and sponsorship deals that barely cover the cost of travel. Imagine finally getting that moment, the superstar, the sellout crowds, the billion-dollar media deal, and then turning around and trying to destroy it yourself. That is exactly what is happening inside the WNBA right now. And what you just heard is only the beginning of how strange this gets. A'ja Wilson, Chelsea Gray, and a group of veteran players allegedly began organizing a physical confrontation planned for All-Star Weekend. The target was a 22-year-old rookie who had done nothing except become the most watched player in the history of women's basketball. The demand they were bringing to her hotel room door was so bizarre that most people who heard it assumed it had to be exaggerated. It wasn't. But before we get into what they were actually planning, you need to understand how the WNBA got to a place where something like this could even happen. Because this story doesn't start with Caitlin Clark. It starts 27 years before she ever touched a professional basketball. The message hit like a freight train, and it came from one of the last people anyone expected to say something like it. A'ja Wilson, 2-time WNBA MVP, Olympic gold medalist, and the undisputed face of the Las Vegas Aces, allegedly put Caitlin Clark on notice ahead of All-Star Weekend. The words were not subtle. She said she would see Clark at the event. That it wouldn't just be her showing up. That Chelsea Gray would be there. That activists from across the league would be there. And that together, as a group, they planned to knock on Clark's hotel room door and deliver a message face-to-face. Read that back slowly and let it sink in. This was not one frustrated player venting after a tough loss in the privacy of a locker room. This was a coordinated effort, a planned confrontation. A group of veteran players organizing to physically show up at a rookie's hotel room during one of the biggest events on the WNBA calendar, with the explicit intention of pressuring her into making a public statement. In what world does that not raise serious alarm bells? Because these are not fringe figures or anonymous social media accounts. These are decorated professionals who have spent their entire careers demanding to be taken seriously, demanding respect, demanding that the world recognize women's basketball as a legitimate sport worthy of mainstream attention. These are players who built the WNBA's identity through years of sacrifice, low salaries, half-empty arenas, and overseas seasons just to make ends meet. And now they were allegedly organizing hotel room confrontations against a rookie who had been in the league for less than a full season. To understand why, you need to understand who Caitlin Clark actually is and what her arrival meant for the league's entire trajectory. Clark came out of the University of Iowa as arguably the most decorated college basketball player the sport had ever produced. She broke scoring records that had stood for decades. She sold out arenas across the country during her college career at a level that rivaled mid-tier NBA franchises. She generated buzz around women's basketball that no player had managed to create since the days of Diana Taurasi in her absolute prime. When the Indiana Fever selected her with the first overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft, the expectations were enormous, and she delivered almost immediately. The Fever, a franchise that had been one of the worst-attended teams in the league for years, suddenly couldn't keep tickets on the shelves. Games sold out weeks in advance. Fans who had never watched a single WNBA game were checking schedules, buying merchandise, and tuning in on ESPN during primetime slots. For anyone looking at this from the outside, Clark's arrival should have been the best thing to happen to the WNBA since the league signed its first television deal. By every measurable metric, it was. But metrics don't capture the cultural tension that was building beneath the surface long before Clark ever set foot on a professional court. Because some of the veteran players didn't experience her arrival as a celebration. They experienced it as a disruption. An outsider walking into a community they had spent decades building and suddenly commanding all the oxygen in the room. Players who had given their entire careers to this league watched a rookie walk in and receive more attention in her first week than they had received in their entire professional lives combined. That kind of resentment doesn't always express itself in rational ways.
Attention, I want attention, but only good attention. As soon as they get that attention, ooh, this is too much attention. Too many people are saying mean things. Too many people are calling me trash. Too many people are saying I can't make layups. Oh my gosh!
But to truly understand the frustration behind what was being said inside the league, you have to hear how some of the people involved actually described the situation. Because nothing captures the contradiction at the center of this story quite like hearing it said out loud. And there it is, said out loud without any apparent awareness of how it sounds to someone listening from the outside. They wanted visibility. They campaigned for it publicly for nearly 3 decades, gave interviews about it, wrote op-eds about it, made it a central part of their public identity as professional athletes. And the moment mainstream attention finally arrived, with all the noise and imperfect fans and online criticism that mainstream attention always brings, the response from some corners of the league was to call it too much. That tension between desperately wanting the spotlight and being genuinely shocked by what lives inside it is the engine driving everything that happened next. And to understand why it escalated as fast as it did, you need to go back to where this league actually started. The WNBA launched in 1997 with genuine optimism riding behind it. The NBA was sitting at the peak of its global influence. Michael Jordan was in the middle of his second three-peat with the Chicago Bulls. Women's basketball had just won gold at the Atlanta Olympics and briefly captured the country's imagination in a way it hadn't before. The timing felt right. The momentum felt real. And for a brief window, it looked like the league might establish itself as a mainstream sports property almost immediately. That window closed fast. By the early 2000s, attendance was already declining. Teams were folding. Franchises were relocating. The Houston Comets, who had won the first 4 WNBA championships in league history, disbanded entirely in 2008. The league contracted from 16 teams to 12 and never fully recovered its footing. Games that couldn't secure prime-time slots ended up buried on cable channels that most sports fans didn't know existed. Tip-off times were scheduled during hours when the target audience was either working, running errands, or simply not in front of a television. The players who lived through this era deserve genuine respect for what they endured. These were elite athletes, in many cases among the best basketball players on the planet at their positions, competing at the highest level of their sport while earning salaries that wouldn't cover a mortgage payment in most major American cities. Many of them played overseas during the WNBA offseason just to survive financially. Russian leagues, Turkish leagues, Chinese leagues, wherever the money existed, they went. Because the alternative was abandoning the sport they had dedicated their entire lives to. And through all of it, they kept asking the same question publicly: why won't anyone pay attention to us? They gave interviews making the case for themselves. They pushed back against the narrative that women's basketball was somehow less worthy of attention than the men's game. They made legitimate arguments about the quality of play, the athleticism, the skill level required to compete at this level. And for the most part, the mainstream sports media nodded politely and moved on to whatever was happening in the NBA or the NFL that week. The average attendance figure during this period tells the story cleanly on its own: 6,000 fans per game. In a country with over 300 million people and a sports culture that borders on religious devotion, the WNBA was drawing crowds smaller than a high school playoff game in a basketball-obsessed state. That is not a rough patch. That is an existential crisis that the league masked with external financial support for its entire existence. Players responded to this reality in different ways. Some became louder public advocates, using whatever platform was available to demand attention and equal treatment. Some channeled their frustration into activism, recognizing that even if the sports world wasn't watching, the political world might be. The WNBA became one of the most politically engaged professional sports leagues in America. Not by accident. but because athletes who felt invisible in one arena found their voices amplified in another. This is where the league's identity began to crystallize around something larger than basketball. The WNBA wasn't just a sports league anymore. It was a statement, a community, a platform, and the people who built that community through 27 years of struggle developed a very specific and very understandable sense of ownership over what it represented and what it was supposed to mean. Then Caitlin Clark walked in and changed every single variable overnight. The numbers surrounding Caitlin Clark's rookie season are genuinely staggering when you place them next to what existed before her arrival. Not slightly better, not incrementally improved. Completely, historically different in ways the league had never come close to experiencing in its entire existence. Before Clark, a successful WNBA game meant drawing somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 fans on a good night. Marquee matchups between top teams might crack 10,000 in the best markets. Playoff games occasionally approached sellout territory. But consistent large-scale attendance was not a reality for the vast majority of WNBA franchises. The Indiana Fever specifically were one of the worst attendance draws in the entire league heading into 2024. Half-empty arenas, thin local sponsorship, minimal media coverage, a franchise that was, by most honest assessments, barely registering in its own market. Then Clark was drafted, and everything inverted almost immediately. Season ticket requests exploded before she had played a single professional minute. Games that would have drawn 4,000 or 5,000 fans were suddenly selling out at 17,000. The team's social media following grew by hundreds of thousands in the span of days. National outlets that had never covered a Fever game in any meaningful way were sending reporters to Indianapolis for routine regular season matchups like they were covering playoff games. The television transformation was equally dramatic. WNBA games had spent years airing on ESPN2 or ESPN Plus during off-peak hours, sometimes tucked behind other programming in slots that felt more like scheduling leftovers than deliberate placement. Clark's debut changed that calculus entirely. ESPN moved Fever games to the main channel, prime-time slots, and the ratings that came back justified every decision. Average viewership for Indiana Fever games during Clark's rookie season reached 1.2 million per broadcast. Average WNBA viewership in previous seasons hovered around 300,000. That is a 400% increase, driven almost entirely by one player's presence in the league. Specific matchups pushed past 2 million viewers. Territory the WNBA had never come close to reaching before. Merchandise told the same story. Clark's jersey became one of the best-selling sports jerseys in the entire country, not just in women's sports, across all of professional athletics. The WNBA's overall merchandise sales jumped 340% in the first 2 months of her rookie season alone. Retailers couldn't keep stock on shelves. Online orders were backed up for weeks. And sitting above all of it was the media rights deal that would define the league's financial future for the next decade. $2.2 billion over 11 years from ESPN, Amazon, and NBC. The previous deal had been worth approximately $500 million over the same timeframe. The new contract is worth more than 4 times as much. It is the single largest financial commitment ever made to women's professional basketball anywhere in the world. And it was made possible, in direct and measurable ways, by what Caitlin Clark's arrival did to the league's commercial viability. By every objective measurement, this should have been a unanimous celebration inside the locker rooms and front offices of the WNBA. Players who had spent years earning salaries in the low 6 figures while playing for franchises that struggled to cover basic operating costs were now part of a league sitting on a historic media deal. The rising tide was supposed to lift every boat in the harbor. Instead, it cracked the hull. Because Clark didn't just bring revenue and ratings. She brought an audience that didn't look like the WNBA's existing fan base, didn't necessarily share its political values, and didn't approach women's basketball with the reverence that longtime fans had developed over years of supporting the league through its darkest periods. Some of her fans were loud. Some were critical. Some behaved badly online. And some were outright racist in ways no professional athlete should ever have to encounter. But what several veteran players decided to do with that reality had very little to do with addressing actual racism. Something far more calculated was taking shape behind the scenes. And the moment that revealed exactly how calculated it was came down to a single decision: when to post a screenshot. Because the timing of what Chelsea Gray did next tells you everything you need to know about how this situation was actually being managed.
It couldn't be deleted. I think the first person I said it to was my wife. And then after that, I actually group chatted Asia, Jackie, and Jewel about it. And it was the first one was like, post it. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to. I'm just letting you guys know what I've been sent. I texted my agent, told him, and I decided to post it.
She decided to post it after the Indiana Fever game because she knows what kind of optics those are. People have already gone in the archives of her Instagram comments. She's been getting called nasty names for quite a while. But once the Indiana Fever come to town and layeth the smacketh down on the Las Vegas Aces. Oh.
Every word of that is accurate, and it applies to every major professional sports league on the planet. LeBron James has been called every name imaginable by opposing fans for 20 years running. Tom Brady dealt with conspiracy theories that followed him across franchises and into retirement. NFL players hear deeply personal insults chanted by entire stadiums on national television every single Sunday. That is the documented reality of playing professional sports at the highest level. The attention is never clean. The fame never arrives without its uglier passengers riding alongside it. What made the WNBA situation different wasn't the existence of hostile fans. It was the decision to hold one specific player responsible for all of them. And that decision had a very deliberate target and a very deliberate moment of execution. On July 14, 2024, the Las Vegas Aces lost to the Indiana Fever. It wasn't particularly close. And in the hours following that defeat, Chelsea Gray made a decision that immediately became one of the most debated moments of the entire season. She posted a screenshot. The image showed a racist, deeply offensive message she had received in her Instagram direct messages. The content was vile. There is no other word for it. No professional athlete, no human being should receive that kind of communication. And in a vacuum, Gray's decision to expose the sender and bring public attention to the harassment she was dealing with would be entirely understandable and fully defensible. But the vacuum doesn't exist here. Context always matters, and the context surrounding this particular decision is absolutely critical to understanding what was actually happening. Because here is what Gray said herself when she explained why she posted that message when she did. Listen carefully to the details she gives, and pay attention to what the commentary points out about the timing.
I don't know, enough is kind of enough.
Can't even think of a reason.
It's not necessarily like, yeah, these messages are not the first of its kind. It's not. There was other stuff too. I just decided to share that one.
After the Indiana Fever game, right? Right.
And also, it was just time. I got fed up with it, and I just decided to share it, and maybe I don't share the other ones.
You are so stunning, brave, and courageous, Chelsea Gray. Oh my gosh. Oh my God.
But I know people will think twice now. We're just playing the game.
What are people going to think twice about?
Did you catch it? She says it herself, clearly and directly. She had received other messages like this one before. She chose not to share those. She chose this particular message on this particular night, immediately after this specific loss to Caitlin Clark's team. The commentary names it plainly. That is not a player at her breaking point finally speaking out. That is a calculated decision about when and how to deploy a story that shifts the entire conversation away from what happened on the court. And it worked exactly as intended. Within hours, the story wasn't about the Aces losing a basketball game. The story was about racism inside the WNBA fan base, about Caitlin Clark's followers, about whether the mainstream attention the league was finally receiving was actually doing more damage than good. Outlets that had been running glowing profiles on Clark's historic rookie season were suddenly writing about toxicity and hate speech. The narrative flipped almost completely in the span of a single news cycle. Now here is where the nuance becomes absolutely essential. Because this situation involves multiple things that are simultaneously true and need to be kept separate from each other. First truth, racist messages are completely unacceptable. No platform should permit them. Anyone sending racial slurs to professional athletes deserves to be banned and potentially faces legal consequences depending on the severity and jurisdiction. There is no legitimate argument that this behavior should be tolerated under any circumstances. Second truth, the deliberate conflation of racist hate speech with ordinary sports criticism is calculated, intentional, and actively harmful to any honest public conversation about the league. When a fan posts that Chelsea Gray played poorly in a game, or that her passing decisions have declined, or that her defensive positioning cost the team a possession in a critical moment, that is sports commentary. It is the same commentary directed at LeBron James, Patrick Mahomes, and every other elite athlete in every major professional sport every single day. It can be harsh, it can be personal, it can be deeply unfair, but it is not racism. And it does not belong in the same category as a message filled with racial slurs. What Gray's framing accomplished, and what several other veteran players adopted in the weeks that followed, was to deliberately collapse that distinction. Any criticism of a WNBA player became evidence of the same toxic wave that produced the racist messages. If you said Gray's layup percentage was concerning, you were part of the problem. If you said Aja Wilson had an off night from the free throw line, you were contributing to a hostile environment. The categories merged into each other, and any attempt to point out the difference was itself treated as proof of hostility. This rhetorical move had one very specific and very useful effect. It made Caitlin Clark's entire audience collectively responsible for the behavior of the worst actors within it, and it built the justification for what was being organized behind the scenes. Because the screenshot was only the opening move in a much larger play. What was allegedly being organized ahead of WNBA All-Star Weekend sounds, when you lay it out plainly, almost too strange to be real. Aja Wilson, Chelsea Gray, and a group of veteran players were reportedly planning to show up at Caitlin Clark's hotel room as a collective and deliver a demand in person. Not an invitation to a conversation rooted through league channels or player representatives. A direct, physical group appearance at her door. And the demand itself was equally extraordinary. They wanted Clark to make a public statement telling her fans that if they had ever criticized a WNBA player online, they were not welcome to watch the league. Sit with that for a moment. They wanted a 22-year-old rookie to stand in front of cameras and microphones and actively encourage millions of new viewers, the exact viewers whose attention had just generated a $2.2 billion media deal, to stop watching women's basketball. The logic being applied here requires careful unpacking because on its surface, it makes no sense at all. Caitlin Clark had not sent those racist messages to Chelsea Gray. She had not posted anything inflammatory about veteran players. She had not made a single public statement that could reasonably be described as hostile toward her colleagues or opponents. She had not encouraged harassment. She had not targeted anyone by name. She had done nothing except become extraordinarily popular in a league that had spent decades trying to become exactly that. Her connection to the harassment was simply this: some people who enjoy watching her play basketball also happen to behave badly on the internet. That was the entire case against her. And the proposed solution was to make her personally responsible for the collective behavior of millions of people she has never met, cannot monitor, and has no mechanism whatsoever to control. Think about what this moment looked like from Clark's perspective. She had just completed what was by any reasonable assessment one of the most intense debut seasons in professional sports history. The level of scrutiny she faced from her very first game was unlike anything a WNBA player had ever encountered. Every decision she made on and off the court was analyzed, debated, and frequently weaponized. Questions about race, about privilege, about whether she deserved the attention she was generating followed her to every press conference and every post-game interview. She dealt with physical play on the court that generated its own separate national controversy. The Kennedy Carter incident on June 1st where Carter body-checked Clark to the floor in a moment that looked more like a street altercation than a basketball foul, became one of the most watched clips of the entire season. Clark handled it without retaliating, without making inflammatory statements through the media, without calling for suspensions or demanding public apologies. She handled the entire season with a composure that was remarkable given the circumstances she was navigating. She showed up. She competed. She gave measured, professional interviews. She didn't inflame situations when presented with obvious opportunities to do so. She played basketball, and she let her performance do the talking. And now, heading into All-Star Weekend, she was allegedly facing a coordinated group of the league's most powerful and decorated veterans, planning to appear at her hotel room door with a political demand that would actively harm her career, alienate her fan base, and damage the financial health of the very league they all shared. The pressure being applied was not subtle. When the most accomplished players in your professional community, people with championship rings and MVP trophies and significant public platforms, organize a group visit to your personal hotel room, the implicit message is not difficult to decode. Agree publicly or face the social and professional consequences of our very visible disapproval. In a league as small and interconnected as the WNBA, where players spend years together in locker rooms and on travel schedules, and at league events, that kind of pressure carries enormous real-world weight. It was, by any honest description, an attempt to pressure a rookie into ideological compliance, using the threat of ostracization from a community she had only just joined. Whether the confrontation unfolded exactly as described remains disputed. It was framed in commentary and reporting as an active plan rather than a confirmed completed event. But the fact that it was being openly discussed, openly advocated for, and openly treated as a reasonable and proportionate response to the situation said something extremely loud about the internal culture of the league at that specific moment. And it forced a question into the open that the WNBA had been quietly avoiding for years. What exactly did this league believe it was supposed to be? Because that question is where the real story has been hiding the entire time. Beneath every layer of this controversy, the screenshots and the confrontation plans and the social media back and forth, there is a genuine philosophical conflict that has been building inside the WNBA for years. Caitlin Clark's arrival didn't create it. She made it impossible to keep ignoring. The conflict comes down to two fundamentally different ideas about what the WNBA is and what it is supposed to become. Both sides of this argument have legitimate points, which is precisely what makes the whole situation so genuinely complicated to navigate. The first vision is the WNBA as a social justice platform that happens to play basketball. In this version of the league, the games matter enormously, but they are not the primary reason the organization exists. The primary reason is representation. Visibility for women athletes in a sports culture that has historically undervalued them. A safe and visible space for openly gay athletes in a professional sports landscape that has been slow to welcome that identity. A platform for racial justice, pay equity, and political activism that other major sports leagues either quietly suppress or actively discourage. The basketball is the vehicle. The mission is the message. Players who built this vision deserve enormous credit for what it cost them. They came out publicly in a sports culture that punished that decision commercially and socially. They kneeled during national anthems when it cost them endorsement deals. They wore warm-up shirts with political messages when leagues were threatening fines. They used platforms that were already small and underpowered to advocate for causes that had nothing to do with pick and roll defense. That took real courage, and dismissing it entirely is deeply unfair to what those athletes actually sacrificed over the course of their careers. Under this vision, the ideal WNBA fan comes to the game with an awareness of what the league represents beyond wins and losses. Someone who understands the history, respects the activism, and shares at least a general sympathy for the progressive values the league has championed publicly. Growth is welcome under this model, but only growth that arrives with the right cultural understanding already attached, not just basketball enthusiasm, the whole package. The second vision is the WNBA as a professional basketball league that happens to include socially conscious athletes. Under this model, basketball comes first, second, and third. Players are valued primarily for their skill, their competitiveness, their ability to fill arenas and drive television ratings. Social activism is entirely acceptable and even admirable in this version of the league, but it is not a prerequisite for participation on either side of the ticket window. A fan who watches because they love the game and doesn't engage with the political dimensions of the league is just as welcome as a fan who shows up with a cause attached. Under this vision, growth is the supreme priority because without it, there is no league. You cannot run a social justice platform if the platform goes bankrupt. You cannot advocate for pay equity if the organization folds because it cannot generate enough revenue to cover basic operating costs. Financial sustainability is not a betrayal of the mission. It is what keeps the mission alive long enough to matter. Caitlin Clark represents the second vision, not because she made a deliberate ideological choice, but simply because of who she is and who followed her into the league. She is a basketball player first. Her fans came for basketball first. The mainstream attention she generated brought in people who don't fit the traditional WNBA demographic, don't necessarily engage with the political dimensions of the league, and don't feel obligated to demonstrate progressive credentials before purchasing a jersey or tuning in on a Tuesday night. For players deeply invested in the first vision, this felt like erosion. The community they had carefully built out of necessity, out of years of being ignored by a mainstream that didn't want them, suddenly had its doors blown open by someone who hadn't paid the same dues, hadn't carried the same weight, hadn't endured the same invisibility. The new audience that followed her in didn't know the history, didn't understand what was built here before they arrived, and some of them were actively hostile to the values the league had always stood for. That feeling is understandable on a deeply human level. But here is the uncomfortable truth sitting directly underneath it. You cannot spend 27 years publicly begging the mainstream to pay attention, and then, the moment it finally does, complain that the wrong kind of people showed up. Visibility does not arrive with ideological prerequisites attached. Fame is not a curated guest list. When you build something in public and it finally reaches a truly public audience, you do not get to hand-select which members of that audience are acceptable and which ones should be turned away at the door. The veterans who built the WNBA into what it became deserve every bit of credit they have earned. But credit for the past does not translate into veto power over the future. And attempting to exercise that veto by pressuring a rookie into pushing away millions of new fans is not protecting the league's values. It is threatening everything those values were always supposed to build toward. And when you strip away the ideology entirely and look at what that strategy would actually do to the league as a functioning business, the picture becomes even clearer. Because someone laid out the financial reality of this situation in terms that are impossible to argue with.
Should I say you're the point fraud, or should I say you're the point you need to leave? Oof, I don't know. What do you really think people are going to think twice about? Well, you think someone who is going to call you a racial slur is going to be halfway through writing that racial slur and say, oh man, that's right, Chelsea Gray. That's right, she said people are going to think twice. Oh, let me put my phone down. That ain't gonna happen.
That we love, that we work so hard to do.
But
it's just a certain division that needs to be brought to everyone's attention and understanding that, no, this is something that's been going on, and it's just getting to a point where it's like, all right, now enough.
Those numbers are not talking points or opinions. They are the actual metrics that convinced some of the largest media companies in the world to write a $2.2 billion check to a league that had never once turned a profit in its entire 27-year existence. 1.2 million viewers per game versus 300,000. 17,000 fans in arenas that used to draw 6. Merchandise sales up 340%. These are the direct, documented, measurable results of Caitlin Clark playing basketball in the WNBA. And the plan, allegedly being organized by veteran players, was to tell the people responsible for every single one of those numbers that they were not welcome here. The WNBA has not turned a profit in a single year since it was founded in 1997. Not one year, not one season, not one quarter. 27 years of professional women's basketball, and the league has operated at a financial loss every single time the books have been closed at the end of a fiscal year. That is not a rough patch waiting to be corrected. That is a structural reality the league has been managing with external support for its entire existence. That support comes primarily from the NBA. The men's league subsidizes the WNBA to the tune of approximately $10 million annually. Without that subsidy, the WNBA does not exist in its current form. The franchises cannot cover operating costs. Players cannot be paid at their current levels. The infrastructure collapses without the financial backstop provided by a men's league that generates billions of dollars in revenue. The women's league has never come close to approaching on its own. Player compensation reflects this structural reality in stark and uncomfortable terms. The average WNBA salary heading into the 2024 season was approximately $130,000 per year. That sounds like reasonable professional compensation until you place it next to the NBA average of over $9 million annually. Elite WNBA players, multiple-time All-Stars, champions, MVPs, were earning salaries that entry-level NBA players would consider an embarrassment. The overseas off-season trips weren't a lifestyle choice. They were a financial necessity for athletes who had dedicated their lives to a sport that couldn't afford to pay them what they were worth. The sponsorship environment reflected the same reality. WNBA franchises struggled to attract local business partners willing to commit significant investment to teams that couldn't guarantee meaningful eyeballs on their brands. National deals occasionally materialized for the visibility benefits and the association with progressive values, but the numbers were small compared to what equivalent men's sports properties commanded without effort. The cycle was self-reinforcing in the worst possible way. Low attendance made the sponsorship pitch harder, which kept revenue low, which kept salaries depressed, which made it harder to retain top talent that could drive attendance higher. This was the financial foundation of the WNBA before Caitlin Clark played a single professional minute. Then her rookie season happened, and the numbers moved in ways the league had genuinely never experienced. The Fever's sellout crowds of 17,000 generated gate revenue that transformed the franchise's financial picture in a single season. National sponsors who had been cautious about WNBA investments were suddenly initiating conversations rather than waiting to be pitched. The social media and streaming metrics that advertisers use to calculate brand value went from modest to competitive with mainstream sports properties almost overnight. And the media rights deal made it permanent. $2.2 billion over 11 years. The previous contract had been worth approximately $500 million over the same period. The new deal is worth more than 4 times as much, and it was negotiated in an environment where Clark's impact on the league's commercial viability was sitting on the table as the primary evidence that this investment was justified. Now consider what the veterans were allegedly proposing in the middle of all of this. They wanted Clark to publicly discourage her fans from watching the WNBA. The fans whose viewership produced those rating numbers. The fans whose ticket purchases created those sellout crowds. The fans whose merchandise spending generated the 340% sales increase. The fans whose very existence at the negotiating table made the $2.2 billion deal possible in the first place. Telling those fans to leave would not be a principled stand or a defensible act of activism. It would be an act of financial self-destruction on a scale that would set the league back by a decade or more in a single news cycle. The sponsors who signed because of those ratings would pull their commitments. The broadcasters who moved games to prime time would move them back to the cable graveyard. The arenas that were selling out for the first time in franchise history would go back to showing patches of empty seats on national broadcasts. And the NBA, watching its annual $10 million subsidy fail to produce a league capable of sustaining itself commercially, would have every justification to reduce or eliminate its financial support entirely. The players who would suffer most severely from that outcome are not the veterans with championship rings and established personal brands that exist independently of the league's financial health. It is the next generation of WNBA players, the ones currently in college programs, the ones about to enter the draft, who would inherit a league diminished and destabilized by a strategy that prioritized ideological control over financial survival. And Caitlin Clark, the person being asked to pull that trigger, had absolutely nothing to gain from any part of it. No player in any professional sport is responsible for policing the behavior of every person who watches them play. LeBron James cannot control what Lakers fans say on social media. Patrick Mahomes cannot prevent Chiefs fans from being hostile online. The standard being applied to Clark was one that has never been applied to any athlete in any major sport in the history of professional athletics. And applying it to a 22-year-old in her first year in the league, based on the behavior of people she has never met and cannot monitor, was not just unreasonable. It was designed to be impossible to meet, because an impossible standard is a permanent weapon. Here is what this entire situation comes down to when you cut through every layer of noise surrounding it. The WNBA spent 27 years in the dark, fighting for a moment exactly like this one. Sellout crowds, primetime television, a historic media deal, a superstar the entire country wanted to watch. That moment arrived on schedule, delivered by a 22-year-old from Iowa who just wanted to play basketball. And rather than seize it completely, a faction of the league's most powerful players tried to smother it because the audience it brought didn't match the community they had spent decades imagining. Caitlin Clark didn't break the WNBA. By every honest measurement, she saved it. Whether the league's veterans are willing to accept that is a separate question entirely. But here is the one that matters most going forward. The most dangerous thing in professional sports isn't a hostile fan base or a toxic comment section. It's a league that finally gets everything it spent 27 years asking for and still finds a reason to push it away. The WNBA is at a crossroads right now. The direction it chooses in the next few years will define what it becomes for an entire generation of players and fans. And the choice is simpler than anyone involved seems willing to admit. You can protect what you built, or you can grow it. But you cannot do both by standing at the door turning people away.